Wyoming PBS, in partnership with Wyoming Public Media and the Wyoming Business Report, are proud to bring you Decision 2014, Wyoming's general election debates.
Good evening and welcome to Election 2014, Wyoming's Choices. Tonight we'll meet the three candidates for Wyoming Secretary of State as they debate in the Little Theater on the campus of Central Wyoming College in Riverton. Wyoming PBS is proud to continue its 24-year tradition of hosting debates of candidates in Wyoming elections. This is the second night of three nights of debates this week. Monday, the candidates for the U.S. House and U.S. Senate debated, and tomorrow, beginning at 7 p.m., we're proud to host the candidates for Wyoming Governor, and at 8 p.m., the candidates for the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Before we begin this evening, Wyoming PBS would like to offer our special thanks to our debate partners, Wyoming Public Media, the Wyoming Business Report, and K2 Television. My name's Craig Blumenshine from Wyoming PBS, and with me in the studio are Wyoming journalists M.J. Clark and Allie Bradley. M.J. is executive editor of the Wyoming Business Report, and Allie is an anchor, producer, and reporter for K2 Television. M.J. and Allie, welcome. November 4th is Election Day in Wyoming, and it's our goal again tonight to provide an opportunity for voters to connect with the candidates and hear from them as they debate side by side, discussing issues that are important to Wyoming. I want to introduce our three candidates, and then we'll briefly review the rules and format of tonight's debate. Libertarian candidate Kit Carson is married, has 3 grown children and 14 grandchildren. Mr. Carson is currently the president of the General Education Foundation, a nonprofit Wyoming publishing corporation that has been in the good standing with the Wyoming Secretary of State's office for 19 years. Mr. Carson was born on a large farm and ranch in California and was graduated from California Community College majoring in veterinary medicine and business, and was on the rodeo team competing in bull riding and bareback riding. Mr. Carson says he is now a retired senior citizen living in Cheyenne. Mr. Carson has studied law and has been a paralegal and registered agent for 35 years and has also traveled to and been interested in Europe and foreign investing. He has been a Wyoming citizen since 1986. Mr. Carson, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Constitution Party candidate Jennifer Young is a homemaker, a home-based business owner, a home preschool grandmother, and a grassroots activist. Jennifer studied zoology, physiology, and bioelectrical engineering at the University of Wyoming and received a Bachelor of Science degree in 1999. Mrs. Young, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Republican candidate Ed Murray is a fourth-generation Wyoming native and was born and raised in Laramie County. He was graduated from Central High School in 1976 and went on to receive a degree in business administration with dual majors in finance and real estate following his college graduation. Ed earned his Juris Doctor degree at the University of Wyoming College of Law before returning to Cheyenne to put his education to use by starting his own business. Ed is married and has raised 4 daughters in Cheyenne. Mr. Murray, welcome to you.
Thank you.
MJ, Allie, and I will alternate asking questions to the candidates, and each candidate will take turns in answering each question first. Each will have 60 seconds to answer, and then the first to answer will be allowed a 20-second rebuttal. Candidates, we encourage you to watch the green, amber, and red signals in front of you. When the light glows red, you may complete your sentence, but that will signal that your time is up. Also, we want to ask our live audience to refrain from applause until the debate has ended. And as we've done in past debates, in the middle of this debate, we'll have a lightning round where each candidate will have 15 seconds each to respond to a 1- or 2-word phrase, and there will be no rebuttals during the lightning round. We have a lot to get to tonight, candidates, so let's begin. And I'll ask the first question. To you, Mr. Carson. Experience is an issue in all debates and in all runnings for all elections. Please describe the qualifications that you feel have prepared you best to serve Wyoming as Secretary of State, and compare yourself to the candidates that you are running against tonight.
I have 60 seconds, that's it?
Yes.
Well, my 45-year career in commerce, investing, law, mortgage banking, and agriculture, and international trade gives me quite a bit of background, experience, and credentials to be the best Secretary of State since 1889 when the Constitution was formed. I've lived in Wyoming a long time. I've lived in many other states and 4 years in Europe. The Secretary of State's office is the only department in the state of Wyoming that makes a profit. several $million a year to the state general budget. I hope to vastly improve that profitability of the Secretary of State's office. I want to become your Secretary of State as to bring several new, fresh ideas and profitable programs to Wyoming and help diversify the economy. I think what the Secretary of State's office needs is a serious businessman like myself, and we don't need any lawyers in there. I'm sorry to say that, Mr. Murray, but I think the voters would prefer a non-lawyer. As for myself, as a longtime law student, I'm not a bar licensed lawyer, but in other words, I know the law, and I will follow the state constitution precisely.
Mr. Carson, thank you very much. Mrs. Young.
Article 4, Section 11 of the Wyoming State Constitution qualifies me. Above and beyond that, I've been a political activist, starting at the local level and escalating to the state level 2 years ago. In that time, I have been present down at legislative session, interim committee meetings, State Loan Investment Board, Board of Land Commissioners, State Building Commission, and many others. I have learned how the state government operates, and most specifically, the Secretary of State's office I've become familiar with.
Thank you very much. Mr. Murray.
Craig, MJ, and Allie, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here standing before you as the Republican nominee for Secretary of State. My name is Ed Murray. I'm a fourth-generation Wyoming native. I'm a family man. I have a wonderful wife of 28 years and 4 incredible daughters that we've raised. I am a businessman, and I believe that is one of the qualifications which best qualifies me for the Secretary of State, which is in large part all about doing business in Wyoming. Mr. Carson indicated that I'm a lawyer. True, I have a legal education, and I'm proud of that, from University of Wyoming. But I've used my law degree in private sector business. And in doing so, I've worked with every level of government government bureaucracies, beginning with the federal, state, and local, and whether it's city or town. And so I know quite a bit about working with government and getting projects done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Murray. Our next question is from Allie Bradley for K2 Television. Addressed first to Mrs. Young.
Ms. Young, being the state with the largest gender wage gap, women earning only 77% of what men earn, which amounts to about 23% of a wage gap. We are the equality state, so what would you do to bridge that gap?
It is not up to any specific executive, representative, or legislator to legislate or mandate that. That is up to the business owner. The individual business owner makes those kind of decisions. And so it would be up to each one of them to provide equal pay across the board for all of their employees.
Thank you very much. Mr. Murray.
You know, as a father of 4 daughters and living in the equality state, this issue of gender gap is of particular interest to me. I believe that there are many factors if you look at the underlying causes for this gap, but the numbers that Ali had indicated are accurate. We must work very, very diligently to provide opportunity for all young men and women in Wyoming at a level that they can call Wyoming their home, raise families, and engage in a livelihood that is competitive across the country. I have great ideas for how to not only take our economy forward, but also to diversify our economy, to make it more embracing of women and their and jobs for women. Thank you.
Mr. Murray, thank you. Yeah. Mr. Carson.
I agree with Ms. Young on the fact that it's not the government's duty to regulate wages and differences. It would seem to me, though, I'm in favor of equal pay. So if we have a beautiful broadcaster like these 2 ladies here, and they're being paid less than the men that are broadcasting, I don't think that's fair. But it's not the government's job to correct it. Conversely, if coal miners are mostly men, and a woman wants to be a coal miner, I don't think that's a good idea. She's not built for it. But if she does, she should get the same pay.
Thank you very much. A rebuttal, Mrs. Jones?
No, sir.
Okay, we'll proceed to our next question for Mr. Murray from MJ Clark.
Secretary of State performs a balancing act when it comes to encouraging businesses in Wyoming. You don't want to make the process so difficult that it discourages the formation of new businesses, but you also don't want to make it so easy that Wyoming becomes a haven for shell corporations. Outgoing Secretary of State Max Maxfield imposed a rule requiring registered agents to have a physical address in the state. Do you feel that this rule is too restrictive, sufficient, or not tough enough, and why?
Everything that you said in preface to your question is true. We have to maintain a careful balance of maintaining that business-friendly mantra while being tough on fraud. One of the steps that Max Maxfield initiated in regards to fighting fraud, in particular in regards to shell entities, was requiring the certified registered agents. And that took us from a state where previously you could have zero physical presence, a P.O. box, for example, as your office, to a state that does demand a physical presence, physical address, a street address that you could walk to and into with that certified registered agent. I believe that is a prudent and necessary measure that we took, and I think there's more that we can do in order to fight fraud, and I look forward to doing that as your next Secretary of State. Thank you.
Mr. Murray, thank you. Mr. Carson.
I would agree with Mr. Murray wholeheartedly on that. I'm a registered agent. I have a physical address, and if you're going to do businesses in this state, whether you're from Michigan or Wyoming, there should be some type of real location or real property that is part of that corporation, whether it's registered agent or the principals. So I agree with Mr. Murray on that.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Young.
I would say that that is sufficient. Perhaps a little bit more, not a whole lot more, but a proof of an intent to remain longer term. Perhaps utility bills in the company's name, phone bill in the company's name. So sufficient, but maybe a little bit more.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, a rebuttal?
Yeah, there is on record with the Secretary of State's office information that the certified register agent must have that does encompass phone numbers and more personal information. The problem is that the crooks will find ways to circumvent disclosure. And so we need to be very proactive in fighting the crooks in ways that involve other investigatory techniques. Thank you.
You bet. Mr. Murray, this question is for you from me. The United States Constitution allows Richard Grayson, an Arizona resident, to run for the U.S. House in Wyoming, and allows William Brick, a New York resident, to run for Wyoming's U.S. Senate seat. Both gentlemen simply need to just be here on Election Day, then if elected, stay in Wyoming. Would you work to propose a constitutional amendment to require that a form of residency becomes a requirement to run for federal offices in all states, just like it is required to run for governor in Wyoming?
I believe I would. You know, the circumstances are such that in Wyoming we're privileged and blessed to have a voting public, the electorate, who understands if there are candidates who have no nexus to the state of Wyoming. We are at a point in our Constitution and in our state, there's so many things going on from a constitutional standpoint, and we need to have a clean, clear direction. And I do advocate for residency as a requirement for running for office. And residency that is meaningful, that has some substance in terms of a nexus, ownership of property, duration, business, having a real tie to the state in which you want to govern.
Thank you. Mr. Carson.
Could you repeat the question, please?
I sure can. The U.S. Constitution allows Richard Grayson, an Arizona resident, to run for the U.S. House in Wyoming. He's on the ballot. And allowed William Brick, a New York resident, to run for the U.S. Senate seat in Wyoming. Both gentlemen simply need to be here on Election Day. Then, if elected, they need to stay in Wyoming. Would you work to propose a constitutional amendment to require a form of residency for federal candidates, just like what's required of the governor to run for governor in Wyoming?
Are you speaking about a constitutional amendment for the state of Wyoming or for the federal government?
It would be the federal constitution.
Oh, that would be a job of insanity. It would take 12 years. So I would think that the governor of the state of Wyoming could have some type of legal influence to nullify that or add additional requirements, because that is the silliest thing I've ever heard of, where candidates from out of state can run in a sovereign state where they don't even have any residency. They don't have a driver's license or anything. But I would not be in favor of a federal amendment. It'll just take years and years and years and years.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Mrs. Young.
I would be in favor of working with other states to change that, however long it might take. Just to vote in our state, there is a residency requirement. I think that for representation, something as delicate as that, representing the people of the state, they should have at least have the minimum requirements of the electorate. So yes.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, any rebuttal?
I believe that we've covered that topic pretty well.
Okay. Our next question is from MJ Clark for Mrs. Young.
Mrs. Young, if elected, what specifically would you do during your first week in office and during your first month in office?
My first week in office, I would certainly work to develop a deeper understanding of the office itself as I've continued to learn, and develop a positive work environment. In my first month in office, I would like to work with the legislators and the elections division to tighten up election laws and see that the Wyoming State Constitution is available to all its citizens again for free.
Thank you. Mr. Murray?
I'm very excited about the prospect of serving Wyoming as the next Secretary of State. In the first day of office, let alone the first week, I will embrace the incredible staff that Max Maxfield has assembled. The deputy and all the supervisors in that office are incredible, talented people who I wish to remain and help to serve the people of Wyoming. In the first month, I want to work very, very hard with the legislative committees for which there will be pending legislation that will directly affect the Secretary of State's office. Another initiative that I would like to undertake in the first month of office involves working with the lobbyists, and in particular the Capitol Club, and setting up a meeting and communication with them so that we can have good work going on in Wyoming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carson.
Having been a registered agent in Wyoming for many years, I'm quite familiar with that office. I've been in there probably every month for 10 years in a row. The staff is fantastic, like Mr. Murray says. And the first thing I would want to do is get to know what's the political rules in this office, who does what. And the first order of business I would take care of is rather shocking. The election process in our state is exclusive jurisdiction of the Secretary of State. And Article 6, Section 13 of our state declares that the purity of our elections must be maintained. Ladies and gentlemen, our electoral process has been corrupted by the federal government about 20 years ago. What did they do? The purity of our elections have been corrupted as follows. The wise guys in the U.S. Congress passed a law called Help America Vote Act. And they foisted upon all the states in the Union, all 50 states, these terrible voting machines for free. They sent them to us and said, you're going to use them. And that's what we have in Wyoming. These machines are manufactured by a foreign power. They're hackable and they're programmable. Thus, we have no more purity in the Wyoming elections. So that's the first order I would challenge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carson. Your time is up. A rebuttal, Mrs. Young.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Our next question from Allie Bradley for Mr. Murray.
Mr. Murray, on a number of instances, the voting status of felons has been revisited right here in Wyoming. Right now, non-violent felons do not possess the right to vote in the Cowboy State. So do you think their voting privileges should be revoked for life, or that they should have a chance for reinstatement?
This is a very good question. It contemplates in my mind some of the deterrents for taking away the voting right. In other words, if the idea that I would have my voting right taken away if I were going to commit a felony that would have a dramatic effect on, hopefully, the any population pondering the consequences. The nonviolent, violent issue and dichotomy is something that we can look at. I believe that, you know, when you do your time, if it's a nonviolent matter, as you attempted to articulate there, if I understood correctly, then there may be a distinction there. And so the right to vote is such an incredible right and privilege. I'd want to not deprive someone of that for a lifetime if it's a nonviolent matter that can otherwise be cleared up. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Mr. Carson.
Could she please repeat the question?
On a number of instances, the voting status of felons has been revisited. Right now, nonviolent felons do not possess the right to vote in Wyoming. Do you think their voting privileges should be revoked for life, or that they should have a chance of reinstatement?
That probably falls in the governor's category, but I would think that, generally speaking, the nonviolent felons should have a chance to recapture their right to vote. The violent criminals, probably no.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Mrs. Young.
There is a method of pardon through the governor already in place. However, for nonviolent crimes, and given that their time is done, all parole, all time is up, they've extinguished their numbers, the parole is done, any other services that they may need to acquire for their rehabilitation is done, then they should be automatically restored.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, a rebuttal?
I don't necessarily agree with the automatic restoration. I say to everyone listening, the right to vote is an honor, a privilege. Do not commit a crime that will take that right and privilege away. Think before you act.
Murray, thank you. Candidates, now we're at the point in the debate that we think will be fun. It's called the lightning round. We'll throw short phrase topics such as term limits to you, and you respond with a short, spontaneous answer. After that, we'll get back to the longer form questions. Our first lightning round topic is from me, for Mr. Carson first. Same-sex marriage.
That's a tough one. I'm a Christian. I don't believe it's right. And it would seem that constitutionally maybe it is correct under the 14th Amendment. So I really don't have an opinion on that, except that it's a difficult subject.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Young.
I hold a biblical worldview, and I acknowledge the authority of the Word of God. And that said, the government has no business mandating personal affairs of that matter.
Thank you. Mr. Murray.
Same-sex marriage is before the courts as we speak. There's going to be decisions made that will affect Wyoming. As for me, in my heart, I believe in the sanctity of marriage between man and woman.
Thank you very much. The next lightning round question from Allie Bradley for Mrs. Young.
Wind River Reservation tensions.
I'm sorry, I don't know about any tension in the Wind River Range, and so what I would say is that a visit to this area is necessary to listen to the people more closely as to what's going on. If you're talking about the land issue.
The question was reservation, Wind River Indian Reservation.
The expansion of that.
Tension, Wind River Reservation tension.
Right. I would have to investigate that topic more thoroughly to have a lightning round response.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Murray.
There is tension. The tribal council recently dissolved. We have the boundary issue, tension among, between the tribes, among the state and tribes. There is tension.
Thank you. Mr. Carson.
As Secretary of State, I would make a sincere effort to visit and communicate in person with the Shoshones and the Arapahoes up on the Wind River Reservation. and listen to them carefully, because most of the state government has not listened to them, and see what their concerns are and help them resolve it.
Thank you. Next lightning round question for Mr. Carson, or excuse me, for Mr. Murray from MJ Clark.
What would you do to improve voter turnout?
Voter turnout is a very complicated matter, has to do with accessibility, the bottom line. I want to make voter turnout more accessible. I have great ideas for that: voting centers, e-poll books, and let's pray for good weather on November 4th.
Mr. Carson?
The question was how to improve voter turnout? That's a very difficult question. I've seen that asked for years and years and years. I don't have any good ideas, except one that I do have. It'll take a lot longer than 50 seconds to tell you about, so I'll just make no comment at this time.
All right, Mrs. Young?
I would say get more people, average people, into office, such as myself, so that the electorate sees hope in the system again.
Thank you. The next lightning round question from me for Mr. Carson. Government transparency.
I think Wyoming does a pretty good job of that, but it can be improved upon. And certainly me as a Secretary of State, I would conduct a very transparent meeting every month on PBS, Wyoming PBS. I'd hold fireside chats with the people, tell them what's going on in the Secretary of State's office and other positive things in the state government.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
Within the Secretary of State's office, I would act proactively in advancing information, advancement and dissemination of knowledge and information regarding that office specifically for the electorate.
Thank you. Mr. Murray?
Transparency in government is a main pillar of my platform, and we're a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and we need transparency in order to ensure that.
Thank you. The next topic from Allie Bradley for Mrs. Young.
Mineral dependency.
We have great natural resources in this state, and it is okay for us to depend to a certain degree on those resources, as long as they are used properly and appropriately and evenly.
Thank you. Mr. Murray?
Mineral dependency, the connotation of dependency is something that I don't agree with. We must exploit and promote and foster the development and exploitation in a good way of our minerals, and there's ways to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Carson?
Mineral dependency, a couple of dirty words, but it's a good business. We're fortunate in Wyoming to have so much minerals, but I would, as Secretary of State's office, I would work very hard to diversify the economy to what ability that office holds. I would be the #1 salesman for exporting Wyoming products, and #1 recruiting agent to bring more in-car monster computers, Microsofts, and certainly the gun industry. I'd like to see Wyoming become the home of a gun industry, firearms industry in America.
Thank you very much. For Mr. Murray from MJ Clark.
Campaign finance limits.
Presently, 1,000 for individuals, 5,000 for PACs. They're on the rise. They are what they are. It's a legislative matter.
Thank you. Mr. Carson?
I would tend to agree with Mr. Murray. I think the campaign limits are appropriate, and we don't need any real big money coming in here to be able to pop $100 grand on a candidate.
Mrs. Young?
I believe they are appropriate. However, I would like to see a cap on total campaign finances one is able to collect, one candidate.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carson, from me, Wyoming's biggest challenge.
Wyoming's biggest challenge. Wyoming's biggest challenge is to have the executive department, including the governor, to enforce the 10th Amendment and keep the federal government out of our hair with all kinds of unconstitutional activity, which they engage in all the time.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
I would say our tendency to reach out to the federal government and invite them in. The federal government oftentimes does not just come in without the invitation. And so less outstretched hands inviting the federal government in.
Thank you. Mr. Murray?
We must continue to keep Wyoming as business-friendly as possible. We must ensure diversification for future generations for employment. And one of the largest challenges that I believe we have is federal encroachment, EPA, et cetera.
Thank you. For Mrs. Young, from Allie Bradley.
Voter poll access.
Voter poll access, I believe, is good. Most places have access areas in each of their precincts that are accessible to all individuals. I don't believe that it should be electronic, if that's what you are indicating towards.
Thank you very much. Mr. Murray?
Voter poll access is one of my platform issues. As I've traveled around 23 counties talking with each of the clerks of the counties who are the generals, ground general, we're advocating, I'm hearing voting centers, and this is a alternative to the traditional neighborhood precinct. It would increase voter access, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carson?
I voted in all the elections since I've been back here. And I've never had a problem with voter poll access. I think what's been set up is excellent. It's very, very good.
Thank you very much. For Mr. Murray, from MJ Clark.
The State Loan and Investment Board and Economic Development.
In many ways, they go hand in hand. The State Loan and Investment Board is a vitally important board for the state of Wyoming. I look forward to taking my perspective as a businessman who knows the importance and the catalyst of investment in our local communities to that board.
Thank you. Mr. Carson?
The Secretary of State sits on that board, as well as 3 others, along with the other executive officers. And I realize it's the most important board, but because I've never sat on it or sat in the committees, I don't have much comment, except that I would bring some very unusual investment opportunities to the board for them to discuss and obtain some dynamic results.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
I would be conservative in my decisions on that board and concerning economic development, making research and sound decisions, and economically fiscally responsible. Pardon me.
Thank you. This will be the last lightning round topic. For Mr. Carson, voter identification.
Voter identification should be an absolute requirement. We can't drive around the state without a driver's license. You have to have voter ID. You go to the library, you have to have voter ID. We need voter ID at the polls, and they have to show their ID so we have purity of the elections again.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
I have to show my driver's license at my poll. And so if that is not being done across the state, it needs to be done. And perhaps we should consider a free voter ID card for everyone. That way we don't exclude that section of the population that doesn't have a driver's license.
Sure. Mr. Murray?
I want to note, Craig, that that identification is necessary for voter registration. Now, at the poll and local level, I'm a local government advocate. I defer to the clerks in that case.
Okay, thank you. We'll resume now our longer form questions. The first longer question will be to you, Mr. Carson, from MJ Clark from the Wyoming Business Report.
During this election, there have been mailers sent anonymously by both sides that contain unflattering information about one candidate. Since these flyers do not directly advocate for a candidate, they may legally remain anonymous. The senders may remain anonymous. Whether it is legal or not, do you believe that this practice is fair and should be allowed to continue in the future elections?
Unfortunately, yes, I agree it should be able to be continued. It's freedom of speech, and people can publish and say anything they want to. If they want to disclose their name, which I always would, that's fine. If they don't want to, it's freedom of speech.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
Yes, I agree with Mr. Carson. That is a matter of freedom of speech. And though it might be unsavory and we might not like it, it is their right. However, I believe that if you have courage in your convictions and in your beliefs and what you are perpetuating to the public electorate, then you should have the courage to disclose yourself.
Mr. Murray?
A lot of what we're talking about stems back to the Citizen Supreme Court case. It's a freedom of speech case for which I am complete in agreement. We need to protect freedom of speech. The disparagement, the negative, what I believe rises to the level of slander in some cases, I don't believe should be tolerated. There are ways, I believe, that you can get through we don't need negative campaigning in Wyoming. And those who engage in negative campaigning, it's my opinion, should be held accountable. We need to have transparency in the money behind these mailers, in who's behind them and why, what organizations, what agenda they have. I think that's fair. If they're going to be making very critical and in many cases false assertions, then I think there should be some accountability to that.
Mr. Carson, an opportunity for rebuttal.
I tend to agree with Mr. Murray, but however, I think it would be at the corporate level or the personal level rather than the government trying to regulate that. The consequences of slander, Mr. Murray as an attorney knows very well, slander and libel, if they've committed that, they're subject to some serious litigation and damages in the courts of law.
Thank you very much. The next question from Allie Bradley of K2 Television for Mrs. Young.
As the elected officials entrusted with keeping an eye on lobbyists, what concerns you most when it comes to the amount of spending lobbyists incur in trying to influence votes in the legislature? And do you believe the state is aware of every cent lobbyists spend in that endeavor?
They are supposed to be aware. That is the agency through which they file all their information. I personally believe that as an officer in any agency, you need to remain a certain degree separated from the special interest groups, and that way you are not as likely to fall into the trap of being bribed by one.
Thank you. Mr. Murray?
I am learning as I campaign and as I go across this great state that we have a very informed legislative body, in my opinion. We have some great leaders. The relationship that they have with lobbyists, I think, is one that is born out of an understanding, a respect, and a knowledge that here in Wyoming, you'll be looking at each other in the eye the next day, the next year. We have an honorable system. Now, that doesn't mean that there should not be transparency, one of the pillars of my platform. And so with respect to lobbying and lobbyists, there are rules right now. They register with the Secretary of State's. And I'm actually in favor of increasing the periods of reporting from annual to quarterly and also decreasing the aggregate from $500 to $50. That helps for that transparency.
Thank you. Mr. Carson?
In all my years in Wyoming, I've never seen in the news any kind of a problem with lobbyists and legislators. I just haven't seen it. So I think that the program that's set up currently is effective and efficient. And as Secretary of State, I would encourage any legislator, any officer that was abused by a lobbyist to bring that complaint to me, and we'll deal with it promptly.
Thank you. A rebuttal, Mrs. Young?
No.
All right. Next question's from me for Mr. Murray. Mr. Murray, how has the State Land and Investment Board, the group of elected officials which the Secretary of State is a part of, held accountable to citizens? What information should citizens have transparency relative to, for example, the $8.3 million grant authorized by the SLIB to Magpul, a Colorado producer of ammunition, magazines for guns, moving its manufacturing operations to Cheyenne?
There should be accountability. I think there is. There's the election cycles for starters. That's one form of accountability. The transparency issue is very, very important to me. Again, it's a pillar of my platform. And I think that some of these issues, some of the various grants and or loans that have originated from the SLIB or the Wyoming Business Council, such as the Magpul, they could be more transparent. We want a system where every citizen of this great state of Wyoming has confidence that the money that we're investing for economic development is without any type of conflict or any type of subversive interest. I'm for free enterprise, I'm for economic development, and in order to ensure that go forward in good faith, we need transparency.
Thank you. Mr. Carson.
As an executive officer sitting on the SLIB board, with my background as a mortgage banker and loan officer, I would take very hard looks at any application for grants. And whatever the results were of that committee, I would have a report every month on my fireside chat, what happened at the SLIB board and where some of this money went, so that people would know what happened.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
Will you repeat the question for me, please?
How is the State Land and Investment Board, the group of elected officials of which the Secretary of State is a part of, held accountable to citizens? What information should citizens have transparency to? For example, relative to the $8.3 million grant authorized by the SLIB to Magpul, the Colorado producer of ammunition magazines for guns, moving its manufacturing operations to Cheyenne.
Really, currently, there is no accountability to the people, and the transparency, as Mr. Murray pointed out, is an issue. I would like to see the accessibility to when the meetings are and the agenda for those meetings a whole lot more readily available. You have to dig to find them. Also, I would like to see the agendas sent to the public in a public announcement form, perhaps, before the meetings, and a significant amount of time before, enough time before, so that people can research that and give input. And I personally think we need to steer clear of the advance or the appropriations of large monies to really any company.
Thank you. Mr. Murray, a rebuttal?
Yeah, my rebuttal is the Wyoming Business Council does an incredible job, actually. And so all the information which Mrs. Young referred to, she would like to see be made available, is available. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've attended the meetings. And what I'm talking about in terms of transparency, some of the grants and so forth have been politicized, and it's taking away from the integrity of the perception.
Thank you, Mr. Murray.
Thank you.
The next question from M.J. Clark, again of the Wyoming Business Report, for Mr. Carson.
Mr. Carson, what do you think are the top 2 land issues facing the State Loan and Investment Board?
The top 2 land issues. Probably is state lands, where half the people believe that we should take the federal land back, and the other half think it's not the appropriate action. I haven't studied that, but I've listened to both sides of the argument, and as Secretary of State, I would bone up on that land board real quick.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
The taking back of the state lands, or the return of the state lands, well, the giving of the state lands to the states, would be the main problem with our lands. I would say leases and regulations on leases, and a little bit more time before the lease is up to come before the SLIB board for a renewal of lease. They wait till the last minute. Oftentimes in those SLIB board meetings, I've noticed that they show up as their leases are due. And so that is, I believe, a problem in our state. We need more time to look over those lease arrangements and make the proper decision for extension.
Thank you very much. Mr. Murray.
Yes, and pardon me, but MJ, I believe you said land issues with respect to the SLIB, but yeah, do you mean the Land Commission?
No, I meant the State Loan and Investment Board in terms of open spaces and things like that.
Gotcha, okay. Well, we have a very important responsibility with our state lands to act as stewards of that property, and it involves best management practices. It involves the management of multi-uses. We must ensure that our natural resources can continue to be exploited in a positive way for the benefit of our citizens, while on the same hand, and this is perhaps one of the bigger issues with respect to the lands, is accessibility for sportsmen and men and women who want to hunt, fish, and commune with Mother Nature. The other big issue that I think is facing our state lands are the listing of, possible listing of like the sage grouse, for example, and other endangered species that have a direct impact on the fabric of livestock producers and so forth.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Mr. Carson, do you have a rebuttal?
No, I don't have a rebuttal.
Thank you. We'll have one final question tonight from Allie Bradley from K2 Television for Mr. Murray.
Mr. Murray, conflict of interest has long been a continuing source of frustration in government. Sometimes state and local politicians voting on issues, they have a financial stake. As the state's top ethics official, what is the view of politicians voting on issues in which they could directly be affected?
Well, this again gets back to transparency and what I would characterize as good government. Conflict of interest is defined for legal purposes as having some type of financial interest, either personally or via relationships in business. That's not right. There should be no conflict of interest. I'll go further. There should not even be the perception of a conflict of interest. And I know from my own experience that perception can be as important as the reality. And so it's incumbent upon every legislator, every decision maker, every public official making a decision that involves a transaction in which there could be some type of interest to absolutely defend the integrity that there is no conflict of interest.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carson.
That's a good question. If I'm elected to the office, I have to take an oath of office and swear on a Bible that I will uphold the Wyoming State Constitution and the federal Constitution. And guess what? If I violate that, it's called perjury. It's a felony. It's 10 years in prison, $10,000 fine. Why doesn't somebody propose for the legislators on every vote they vote for anything that there's a codicil at the bottom, like a little oath of office? I do not have a financial interest in this matter, or a perception, or whatever the language would be. And if they sign that, they better be honest, because if they violate it, it's perjury.
Thank you. Mrs. Young?
Conflict of interest is a problem, and this is why we need candidates and representatives who will operate with the utmost of integrity and take personal responsibility for excusing themselves if there is even a perceived conflict of interest.
Thank you very much. Mr. Murray, any rebuttal?
Well, it's a very good question, and living in Wyoming, we have family, friends. We're one of those, we're a big family, and so it's a particularly sensitive issue that must be acknowledged and dealt with. Thank you very much.
Candidates, we're nearing the end of tonight's debate, and we are thankful for your participation. We're at the point now for you to have the last word. And we now will proceed to closing statements, the order of which we've drawn has been predetermined, and the order will be you first, Mrs. Young, followed by Mr. Carson, and then Mr. Murray. You have 90 seconds for these closing statements.
Thank you. First off, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight and taking time out of your busy schedule and away from your families to be here. And I'd like to tell you I'd be honored to serve you, fellow Wyoming citizens, as Secretary of State, and I promise to serve with honesty, integrity, and constitutional focus. I will be the candidate that brings to this table a people-focused decision mechanism. I will provide for purity of elections. I will be the candidate that helps to provide a smooth transition during the Capitol reconstruction and the move there for maximum customer service. And I would like to just tell you all, thank you again for coming. Be safe going home. And remember on November 4th to vote young.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Young. Mr. Carson, your turn.
I'm very humbled to be here tonight. I'm very thankful for this opportunity. I'm very thankful to live in Wyoming with all the great benefits we have here for the people in this state. When I take that oath of office, it's just like when I was a Boy Scout. It really means something. And I will be a constitutional thinker and a very open office where the citizens have direct access to me or my associates. I have many ideas to put forth to the governor and the legislature, but we don't have time to discuss them. But the purity of the elections is one of the most important things. And the power that the Secretary of State has, by the power invested in me, I will get rid of all the electronic voting machines. Bang! We'll have purity of elections again.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Mr. Murray.
Well, thank you to PBS and Allie and Craig and MJ for your moderation tonight. I want to thank all the listeners who are tuning in and the viewers watching tonight. I want to thank my family who has worked tirelessly for me and with me during this lengthy campaign. Over the last 6 months, we've traveled upwards of 50,000 miles and meeting tens of thousands of people, and I'm honored to stand here tonight as your Republican nominee for Secretary of State. Ladies and gentlemen, it'll be an honor and a privilege to serve you as the Secretary of State. I'll take my 5-point platform into the office. I will help modernize and digitize the business side of the office. With respect to the elections, I will ensure I will safeguard fair elections and strive to increase voter turnout. On those important boards, the SLIB, the Commission, and the Building Commission, the Land Commission and the Building Commission, I will provide invaluable insight and perspective based upon my background. Additionally, I will fight fraud. This is a problem that I want to undertake as one of the main pillars of my platform. And finally, I will advocate strongly for the investment of greater Wyoming wealth into our local governments as a local government advocate. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ed Murray, Republican nominee for Secretary of State. I look forward to serving you as your next Secretary of State. May God bless you all, and don't forget to vote.
Thank you very much. And that's it for our debate tonight. I want to thank the 3 candidates for participating in tonight's debate and offer my special thanks to MJ Clark from the Wyoming Business Report and from Allie Bradley from K2 Television. Also, thanks again to our Wyoming PBS crew who are working hard behind the scenes, keeping the cameras and microphones working. Tomorrow, please join us for our last in our series of general election debates when we'll hear from the candidates for Wyoming's governor and for the candidates for the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. Those debates will be broadcast live at 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. respectively. And a reminder, you can watch this debate and all of the Wyoming PBS debates, including primary election debates, on our website at wyomingpbs.org/debates. On that sign, you'll also find rebroadcast information for our debates on Wyoming PBS and on K2 Television. From all of us at Wyoming PBS, thank you very much and good evening. We'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow night for the gubernatorial and the State Superintendent of Public Instruction debates.